Welcome to a public forum on education for a global community. And thank you, Professor Emeritus Morton Deutsch. And the reason we now have a Morton Deutsch Center on International Cooperation and Conflict Resolution, which created in 1986 and was a very, very significant TC first among the many fields that have started here and flourished here. And this center, which we've all known as ICCCR, has now been officially named the Morton Deutsch Center. So I think we should all give that a round of applause. That and his other many accomplishments, which we all know about, would be enough, but no. Morton continues to lead us and to persist in looking at the critical challenges of our time and in seeking solutions. And so this evening he's brought together distinguished scholars to do just that. And we have TC senior faculty members here and a guest from the Earth Institute. And I gather, Morton, you're going to introduce everybody, or someone is, so I won't take up time doing that, but they'll share ideas on building a cooperative global community from the perspectives of their various disciplines and hopefully involve everyone here in discussion of that. So this is the TC way, looking at new challenges in a very multidisciplinary fashion and trying to merge scholarship with making a difference in the real world. And to keep our eyes fixed on the future. 125, but we're always thinking of what we're going to look like when we're 250, and we can look back and hope that the next 125 years are as productive as the first. So let's get us started on that next slide.
I think we're all going to speak from our seats, and so I will started off by doing that. I'm very delighted that we're having this public forum. I think it's one of the most important things we can do now, to think of the future, to think of what the world is going to be like in future generations. And my remarks will be about the importance of developing a global community. Now consider a group of people who are part of the same family, have common ancestors, live in the same neighborhood, and together form an interdependent community. They face some serious problems which will affect adversely the lives of and well-being of many of the people in the community, as well as make much of their neighborhood less habitable. This will happen unless they're able to cooperate effectively to manage these problems. It seems clear that such a group of people are apt to be considerably more successful in dealing with their problems if they are a strong community whose members are very much identified with it and committed to its survival and its effective functioning. The people who live on planet Earth, a very distinctive neighborhood in the universe, are members of a human family with a common ancestry. The people of the Earth face serious problems which will affect them and their planet with much adverse effects unless they're able to organize themselves so that they can cooperate effectively to deal with these problems. They do not as yet appear to have developed two of the key social psychological prerequisites of effective cooperation: a strong community with members who are strongly identified with it, and members who are committed to helping the community develop the values, knowledge, and skills to engage in effective global cooperative problem solving. We need a global community because the people of the planet Earth face some important common problems. Many problems could be enumerated, to mention just a few: global climate change, weapons of mass destruction, gross injustices to women, people in poverty, to people who have different races or have social inequalities of various forms. And there's sexism, and there's the inadequate education of children in this world to be capable, responsible world citizens. Now, how do we move towards a world community? That's the problem that I think we have to face. With Sarah Razitzi, I mispronounced your name, Sarah, sorry, and Eric Marcus, I presented a social psychological perspective and have identified important issues that need much further intellectual work. Now, it's clear that many different academic disciplines, as well as others, will have to do much creative work to help in the development of a cooperative, cohesive global community. Among the most important of the disciplines is that of education. It needs to develop the knowledge, policies, and procedures which will help people of the earth, adults and children, understand how interdependent we all are, the importance of a global community, and the knowledge and skills to become effective global citizens. It's clear to me that in this public forum, we shall only touch upon some of the important issues in educating for a global community. Our hope is that this forum will provide impetus for more work and more involvement of faculty and students in this vital endeavor. Now, the forum is organized so that each of the distinguished speakers will speak for no more than 10 minutes. Then we shall have breakout groups for 30 minutes where people can meet with one another and with one of the individual presenters and suggest and develop plans for future actions, such as perhaps establishing a GC Institute of Education for a global community, developing seminars on this topic, developing a pledge for nonviolence that all students and faculty and school personnel can be invited and helped to participate in. These are some of the potential actions that may emerge from our discussion. But what emerges is up to you and to our distinguished speakers. And finally, we will have, after the workout groups, a 15-minute session where we get together and hear summaries of what each group has done. Then, subsequently, our group here will all meet and review everything that has gone on and also consider what the next steps will be. Now let me conclude by quoting from Colin McCann, a very fine novelist. It's more difficult to have hope than to embrace cynicism. Let us maintain hope that we can improve the world rather than embrace the cynicism that it cannot be done. And let us act to fulfill our hope. So I now turn to our first presenter, Warner, and then Warner will subsequently pass on the microphone to each of the other presenters.
When introducing someone in Japan, the higher the status of the person, the shorter the introduction. So for the next hour, Mort is going to introduce me. It's just a joke. Case number one. The title of my short talk might be something like Developing Cross-Cultural Competence. So case number one. I've been involved in the field of organization development for practically all of my life, it feels like. And so in 1969, Richard Beckhart, one of the three mentors in my life, and I were going to the UK to establish an OD program there for two companies, Imperial Chemicals Industries and Shell, Royal Dutch Shell. And so on the plane going over, he was showing me how to count money in British, and the pound versus the dollar, and things like that. It was my first time. Anyway, the first night we were there, we were invited to the home of one of the sponsors from ICI of the program that we were to design and deliver in the future. And in the conversation, I said something like American history. And I don't remember the sentence, but I said American history. And our host scoffed. He said, "Ha, that's an oxymoron." He says, "America has no history." And I guess compared to the United Kingdom, we don't. We're a couple of 2 or 3 centuries. They're many, many centuries. So what's the moral of that story? More often than not, natives are proud of their heritage. Remember that. Case number 2. We're moving along. There's going to be 3, so hold on. Case number 2. This is Japan. I was, at the time, this is 1972, we're moving along too, 1972. And I was with the National Training Laboratories full-time, which was a department within the Division of Adult Education of the National Education Association. So I drew a check from NEA, believe it or not, for quite a number of years. And some people in Japan wanted somebody from NTL to come over and tell them what organization development was all about and help them to design a program of delivery for that. So I was the designated driver. So I go over and trying to model what OD stands for, I was meeting with a group of people to do the planning. And so what I was trying to do was involve them. That's what we do in organization development. It's a participative, and it's group discussion, and we try to reach a consensus and all that kind of good stuff, and that's what I was trying to model. In trying to do that, the consequence of it was total silence. And almost for an hour, we sat there kind of looking at one another, and so forth. So finally, I lost my patience. And I went up to the flip chart and designed a 5-day program, Monday through Friday. And when I did that and sat back down, they all breathed a sigh of relief and said something to the effect in Japanese, "Thank God, this guy finally told us what to do." So what's the moral of that story? It is, be clear about your role when invited into another culture and what is expected of you in that role. In this case, I was expected to be an expert. Case number 3, into the future. I've been asked, but I consider going to Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, and would I tell them something about organization change, executives of a particular company in Abu Dhabi, which is into clean energy kinds of activities. Interesting organization, because what they're concerned with is an alternative to oil. And so they're looking into all other forms of energy, and also they're very concerned about water, as you might imagine. So in considering to go there, to explain organization change to them, it became clear to me that I need to understand that culture. Because if I'm going to talk to them about something along the lines of organization development, it means that I'll be preaching participation, involvement, engagement, group activity, and all that kind of thing. That's not their culture. It's a class system. And the Arabic people are in charge, let's be clear. Expatriates do the work. And there are multiple classes for that. So if I'm going to explain the way we do it here, it's probably not going to work. So I've got to figure out how to be sensitive to how they think about change and whether or not I can contribute to any of that. And I'm not sure I can, but I'm willing to maybe consider giving it a try. So in any case, I must be clear that leading and managing change there successfully is not likely to look like we do it here. For example, being collaborative, rather than things being hierarchical and so forth and so on. So the final part that I want to say, it has to do with the competencies that are required when we're trying to build a global community and being very sensitive to other kinds of cultures. So knowing your own culturally related assumptions and knowledge is important. That is your own self-awareness about your roots and your ethnicity and what I would call cultural intelligence. That's a new term, folks. It's kind of like emotional intelligence, so I wanted to catch on, and you heard it here. So cultural intelligence. Anyway, to have a positive, this kind of intelligence has a positive effect on individual task performance. There's evidence to support that statement, by the way. So that the more sensitive we are to differences, usually that leads to higher performance, at least in the small groups setting. Behaviorally, it means the ability to act according to culturally accepted rules and activities and norms. And evidence also shows that extended exposure helps. So get a passport if you don't have one, and so forth. I think the other thing too, there are two other points I want to make, and I'm almost done. One has to do with Terry Maltvia, who teaches here and conducts the certification program and coaching and so forth, but he also comes and does other kinds of presentations for us and other programs and so forth. So what he does is a session that uses an instrument, an assessment instrument called IDI, and don't ask me to tell you what those letters stand for, I can't remember. But what it measures is one's level of experience and competence in cross-cultural dynamics and understanding. So it's not a matter of getting a score and saying it's just the way you are. It's getting a score and saying this is what you know and what you may not know. And so, well, what he's found and what I found too, and looking at it with some people that were coming through our programs here, is that most people overrate themselves and think they know far more than they do with respect to cross-cultural dynamics and understandings. So can we be kind of clear about the fact that we may be overly rating ourselves about our own competence? Finally, the last book, I think it was, that John Nesbitt wrote, besides Megatrends, was something called The Global Paradox. And what that book was about was the world going more and more global, but at the same time, local desires were paramount. So you may think global and have a global mindset, but people really do think in just as strongly, if not more so, about their own local situation and their own ethnicity and their own norms. We must be sensitive to that, and that everybody's not maybe on the bandwagon of global mindset as we should be. So if we're going to do the kind of work that we're talking about, we've got to be more confident ourselves with respect to cross-cultural dynamics.
Well, thanks very much for having me on this panel, Mort, and thanks Teachers College for inviting me to come speak from the Earth Institute. The question that brings us together this evening is how can we as educators foster and transfer the knowledge needed to build a cooperative global community? As I've thought about this question, I've kept returning to the idea of community and asking myself what defines one. And as I've pondered this, I find myself thinking deeply about the biological definition of the term, where community is defined as a group of species inhabiting and interacting in a common location, a habitat. Under that conceptualization, three aspects of community are key. First is the composition of the community, the group of species interacting. Second is the space in which these actors interact, the space that they share, with its physical properties and unique characteristics. And third is the set of social dynamics that are produced through interaction in and with that space. Now, the structure of the community depends on the influence that actors place on each other given those physical constraints. And community dynamics, then, are the product of individual responses to those interactions. And that biological conceptualization resonates with me, particularly because my own work revolves around ecology and social ecological systems. On its own, though, I find that biological conceptualization wanting, especially when trying to apply it to humanity. So a second conceptualization is community as a group coalescing around shared beliefs, values, and attributes. In this perspective, community is a psychological and a social psychological identity based on common interests, attitudes, and goals. Community in this sense is a fellowship strengthened through in-group cooperation. And this definition, I think, is an important supplement to the biological one, in that it makes the requirements for community membership explicit. With those two conceptualizations, the question before us is how can education contribute to building a cooperative global community? Before responding to that, however, there are some assumptions built into it that should be explored. The first of these is the assumption that community should be structured around cooperative dynamics as opposed to competitive or conflictive ones. And the second assumption is that the community should be global as opposed to regional, national, ethnic, political, or economic. So why strive for these things? Is there some moral imperative to do so? For instance, does social justice or some other normative framework require that we expand our sense of community to the global scale? And is that normative framework best served by cooperating? Or is the need for a cooperative global community really a question of system maintenance? In this case, does expanding our definition of community lead toward a more realistic understanding of the global system? And does cooperation provide a more effective, or perhaps a more expedient path to sustain system functioning? While the former of these, global community as a moral imperative, is philosophically interesting, I'll argue tonight that the latter is probably a better basis for pursuing a cooperative global community. In other words, that a global sense of community is necessary for basic system maintenance. The question posed in the symposium calls for explicitly defining the geographic boundaries of community according to our planetary boundaries. When I look at the trophic structures of the global system, that is to say the ways in which energy and material flow through the system, two things are immediately apparent. First, that we're inexorably tied to the biological, physical, and ecological cycles in the system. And second, that these cycles are changing rapidly and in unpredictable ways, thus jeopardizing the integrity of the system, and with it the probability of our species' survival in the future. So my own work seeks to find solutions to some of our most pressing sustainability dilemmas through a host of experiences working on food security in sub-Saharan Africa, in forest governance in the Amazon, and in public land management here in the US. I've come to appreciate that mitigating the threats to sustainability requires expanding our scope of community to incorporate all the actors in the system, all the actors who affect the system. In the context of a world where material and energy flow across the entire planet, interactions in far-flung corners have real and tangible impacts throughout. And John Muir aptly described this, saying, "When one tugs at a single thing in nature, he finds it attached to the rest of the world." To understand how we are affected by and how we affect the system, we need to adopt that biological conceptualization of community. This, however, begs the question of community membership. Certainly, expanding our spatial definition of community to the global scale mandates that all humans be recognized as community members. However, returning again to the biological construct, the question then becomes not whether non-human species are actually community members, but instead whether or not we choose to acknowledge their membership. If we ignore their membership, we excuse ourselves from extending the rights of membership to them, namely survival and pursuit of common well-being. We also excuse ourselves from the responsibilities of community membership that dictate how we treat other community members. If, however, we merge both the biological and the social conceptualizations of community, we're suddenly confronted with the need to dramatically change the ways in which we conduct ourselves in the shared physical space, as well as the ways in which we interact with other community members. Imagine for a moment what the impact would be of actually affording community membership rights to non-humans in the system. Would we face some of the sustainability dilemmas that we do now? So what's the role of education in bringing about a new or expanded idea of community? Our traditional or dominant educational paradigms have done very well at enabling us to dissect and disaggregate phenomena in order to study their constituent parts. This is, after all, the foundation of positivist empirical study. And while that's only one paradigm among many, it happens to be the paradigm upon which most of our political, economic, and social structures are built. And those structures are built on that paradigm precisely because it offers predictable returns on immediate actions. That paradigm, however, leaves us ill-equipped to integrate what we know about the dynamic interactions of human and other subsystems into a systemic view in a sophisticated way. Until relatively recently, at least in a geological sense, this hasn't been much of a problem. However, we're increasingly seeing the cumulative impacts of decisions, actions, and policies built on that disaggregated approach. We needn't belabor many examples here tonight, but suffice it to say that those examples are increasingly abundant, ranging from heavily polluted physical spaces to violence over scarce resources to changing disease patterns associated with shifting temperatures. In this context, simply expanding our sense of community to include all humans on the globe won't be sufficient to understand, let alone prescribe solutions for such challenges. Rather, what we need is to teach a new paradigm, or a new dominant paradigm, that can enable us to both disaggregate system components and then integrate specialized knowledge on system functioning into our policies, actions, and strategies. Expanding our view of community according to the biological definition, and merging that view with a sense of community as fellowship could potentially serve as that paradigm. Aldo Leopold famously said, "We abuse land because we see it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect." And I'd echo that here. But I'd also add that when we view ecosystems and other species as members of a global community, then we have both a framework and a mandate to pursue our interests in ways that will promote system functioning rather than threaten it. The Academy has, throughout its existence, been critical of dominant paradigms, or at least advanced alternative constructs. And indeed, these alternatives are taught to varying degrees at most institutions of higher learning. However, when our students leave the university, do they implement these alternatives? Or do they defer to business as usual in our traditional political and economic structures? And I'd argue the latter. And this is, I think, a failure of our educational system. Henry David Thoreau once said, "A truly good book teaches me better than to read it. I must soon lay it down and commence living on its hint. What I began by reading, I must finish by acting." In order to bring about the concrete action toward productive change, we must turn the alternative paradigms that we teach into the book that Thoreau describes. We must find ways to educate that elicit a response, that encourage change, and that can translate critical thought into real actions. Our students must take the best insights that our science and knowledge have and translate these into new political, economic, and social models outside of the academy. And that's the challenge for us as educators. I'll end my thoughts with a quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. He said, the reason why the world lacks unity and lies broken and in heaps is because man is disunited with himself. I'd change that, though, to say that man is disunited from his community in the biological sense. We as educators have the ability to rectify that, but doing so requires that we find and teach ways of integrating our highly specialized understanding of disaggregated parts of the world back into our understanding of the system. Doing this, I think, requires that we build a cooperative global community. And now I'll turn the time to my colleague, Bill Gaudelli.
Thanks so much, Josh. It sounds as though we planned our papers together, although we didn't. That's really lovely. Thanks more for organizing this, and to my fellow panelists for making the event possible, and for all of you for coming. It's a pleasure to have these opportunities, so great to be here tonight. The question that I'd like to take up is, what would it mean to be a global college? And I think when I start to think about things globally, there's an attempt often to throw it somewhere else. And I want to make it real right here, because I think that's the first step for all of us to begin to think globally and then, therefore, to teach globally. I want to move far away first in an effort to come back to TC, a brief figurative excursion towards homecoming. I want to begin in Thailand at a school that I've been working in and visiting lately, one based loosely on Waldorf principles a la Rudolf Steiner with a dash of Maria Montessori. There are many remarkable things about this school, which is why I continue to visit and dialogue with them. They embrace inquiry and its uncertainty as courses of study are framed by and around student questions and concerns, felt problems. They're locally rooted in teaching, for example, about hundreds of Thai rice varieties. Of course, I didn't realize there were hundreds, but there are, through raising crops themselves, spending a week in expeditionary learning, working with rice farmers to recognize and value the real challenge of bringing a crop to harvest. And they explore this all done throughout the region and through the world in their academic study. But perhaps most stunning to me about this from the West is that they truly live together. During my week there this past August, the entire community stops to have lunch together. Try to imagine this in our workplaces. So students worked in teams to prepare meals for each other. They shopped at local markets to learn what was being available at that time in season, to prepare the food and doing the cleanup afterwards. Faculty did the same in buffet style, sitting at large tables, eating a delicious local variety, and then cleaning plates afterwards. The previous summer, I participated in a faculty meeting where instructors sat in a circle for 3 hours and talked about how their lives were going, what challenges they had with family and friends, and how this was affecting their teaching and research. We have a faculty meeting here tomorrow in this room, and I try to imagine how improbable a meeting like that would be. In fact, after this meeting with my friends in Thailand, they turned to me and said, "Do you have these sorts of meetings at Columbia?" All the time. So, to think of us having meals to prepare together, sitting together, conversing together, and sharing together, to really living as a family together. It's difficult to imagine, and yet, in line with what Josh said, I think if we inhabit the notion of community here, then we can grow it outward elsewhere. If you're like me, you have lunch in between email responses. Now, don't get me wrong, I love the food service here. We're about to get more. But the speed that we work with comes at some cost. That the making of food that we eat can seem alien in a sense, modernly tucked away in its preparation, consumption, and disposal. John Dewey, a well-known chicken farmer who resided for a time on Long Island and who also happened to teach philosophy around here, had these same concerns. He worried that modernity's convenience and speed would drive a wedge between people and their rudiments, between the labor of the day being connected to the bounty of the evening's table. As he offers, Plato speaks of the slave as one who is in his actions does not express his own ideas but those of some other man. It is our social problem now, even more urgent than in the time of Plato, that method, purpose, understanding shall exist in the consciousness of the one who does the work, that this activity shall have meaning to themselves. Education then would help children locate the processes of life in the everyday experience of making a life, one that was necessarily social, fundamentally global. I read this in Dewey's work some years ago, but it never made more sense than at this school in Thailand this summer. Dewey's education was fundamentally global, not dressed up in salon parlance, being education pure and simple, as you might say, ironic in its mundane transcendence, simply an education worthy of its name. If Teachers College is to engage planetarily, then surely we must bring our daily routines into sync with the flow of life on the planet, and in relation to the necessities that bind us together. We must live with the recognition that Martin Luther King implores, that our interdependence is myriad beyond naming, all before we rise for breakfast. I must have been hungry when I wrote this. A lot of food references. So knowing the incomprehensibility of our connections and our blissful and fleeting awareness of the same, how do we teach globally? What would it mean to have a global teachers' college? I'm struggling with that question now, though happily not alone, with partners here and beyond at TC, in the nonprofit sector and beyond. We're creating an online global certificate program, one that we hope will help teachers to learn about the world in deep ways so they can engage their students in just the same type of learning. We're excited about its possibilities, we're anxious about the questions that it raises for us, and we hope that the program will spark an enthusiasm and a commitment on the part of teachers to recover that original impulse that every teacher with whom I've ever worked has to change the world, that is sometimes dulled by the drone of requirements that has set aside the essence of teaching, that spark that makes the aesthetic engagement possible. I look forward to what new questions and problems this project will generate. Surely they will. And it brings me a sense of humility to do this type of work, because inevitably there are new plateaus and vistas from which to see. Ultimately, what questions it will demand as we seek to support teachers will guide, I hope, children to inhabit a shared planet of justice, ecological harmony, and peace. My hope is that the current policy reform cocktail, themselves an ironic form of global education since they are driven by national impulses to compete economically, will burn out in time for us to save ourselves on this planet, we would be wise to recall the words of TC's Larry Kremen, who wrote, "To contend that the problem of international competitiveness can be solved by educational reform is not merely utopian and millennialist, it is at best foolish and at worst a crass effort to redirect attention from those truly responsible." If we need a reminder of the dire planetary situation we're in, we can all read the reports in the Philippines just 3 weeks ago. I know some will deny the imperative of global climate change as coming from the Jeremiahs of social reconstruction. I suggest rather that we are simply people overwhelmed with the idea that one generation can act myopically to put economic gain above all else and to risk that their children, all of our children, and generations to come may not enjoy the splendor and beauty of what it means to live on this planet. I would like to leave you with one thought. My back of the napkin math, and I'm not very good at it, coupled with my reading of Bill Bryson indicates that none of us in this room are strangers. If you assume that each new generation arises approximately every 30 years or so, and you trace your family line back through the past millennium, you have millions of grandparents, of which you are a direct descendant, or more accurately, we together have millions of grandparents that we share. We should live with this idea in Dewey's phrase, habitually, not as though we are family, but in the knowledge of our fundamental familial being. That simple yet profound idea can help us move towards planetary existence, perhaps more than any other. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everybody. And let me thank Mort also for the idea of this forum and for the invitation to this forum. And it's, I was saying to Victoria before we began that it's very rare that we colleagues at Teachers College actually get to share ideas together. This has been a delight, so it's really fun. As we've heard from previous speakers, there could hardly be a more auspicious, if not urgent time for gathering to share research and perspectives on the prospects for a truly global community. I spend a lot of time these days in schools and with school people, and I'm struck by the more or less constant pressure that they're under to keep thinking about and articulating their values about who they are, what their identity as educators shall be in the rapidly changing cultural, social, economic, and political world that we find ourselves in today. Every single educator I've met in recent years, from veteran kindergarten teachers through freshly minted assistant professors, seems mindful of and often deeply concerned about what some call the acceleration of change in our era. And Bill referred to that nice quote from Dewey about speed, the intensification of speed. There's always been change in human life since the very dawn of culture, of course. But today things seem to be moving extra fast, juxtaposed with many worrisome issues such as ethnic and sectarian strife, population growth, environmental damage, and climate change, and the like. There seems to be a widespread feeling in the zeitgeist that we're standing as human beings on an unsteady platform with a great many uncertainties and confusions surrounding us. I've been working for the last decade now on a philosophy of education and a philosophy of life that I like to think can assist us in keeping our ethical and political balance, and that might, I think, contribute to something about the idea of community that Josh nicely formulated in his paper. It's a philosophy that I think can help us respond rather than react to the speed of change. And a response is very different from a reaction. We humans all too often react to change. That is, we often act quickly and thoughtlessly, without giving ourselves the time to consider wise courses of action. Wise courses of action, that's the meaning of response as contrasted with reaction to change. A response entails considered reflection on our values, our aims, our hopes, and allows us to bend but not break with the wind, as the familiar saying has it. This philosophy of education and of life that I think can be of help here can be summarized in the idea of cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism as a term of art or concept that captures, I think, what it means to approach life in an educational spirit. That is to say, a spirit of learning from life in order to respond to life. Cosmopolitanism, as you know, it's a complex, it's a much debated term these days. In some respects, it's a rather unhappy concept. For one thing, the familiar fashion magazine by that name, Cosmopolitan, along with the new Las Vegas hotel casino, that's also has the same name. These sort of images conjure the stereotypical idea of the cosmopolitan as an elite globetrotter who treats the world's cultures and traditions as a source of commodities to consume and trophies to collect. For another thing, another reason why the term is somewhat unhappily chosen, it can also at first glance imply a rejection of local culture, local custom, and local tradition. Its originary meaning in ancient Greek, the term cosmopolites, is typically translated as citizen of the world. An image which I think can suggest problematically that there is a more important, call it universal moral platform that completely trumps what is provided by one's natal roots in one's local community. However, on the basis of, like I say, a long-term inquiry into the history of the concept of cosmopolitanism and into its contemporary manifestations, I've come to understand the idea, this cosmopolitan idea, as an embodied educational orientation towards one's experience as a human being, very much an embodied educational orientation towards our experience. And in this orientation, people learn to fuse what can be called reflective openness to new people, ideas, practices, and values, with reflective loyalty or devotion to local commitments and forms of life. The qualifier reflective here implies a critical as well as appreciative aspect. It conjures familiar notions of open-mindedness, articulated by the likes of John Dewey, Martha Nussbaum, William Hare, and others. But the orientation responds not just to what is new, but also incorporates, as I mentioned, reflective loyalty or devotion to what is known, that is to say, to local values and local origins. And here the qualifier reflective, as in reflective loyalty, is crucial because we know that loyalties can all too easily morph into fundamentalisms. So the idea of reflective loyalty or devotion, and here I'm drawing especially on the thinker Hosea Royce, who has a beautiful book on the concept of loyalty. This notion of reflective loyalty spotlights why a cosmopolitan-minded relation with tradition, or with home, or with local custom, is neither idolatrous nor dogmatic. Rather, it constitutes what I think of as a supple relation, characterized by sufficient respect or gratitude for one's formative origins, such that a person knows, if not in so many words, that cultural reverence can be sustained, and indeed often deepened, even as the particular contours and character of revered things change over time. And these things can include religious traditions, ideals such as justice and practices associated with them, works of art, and much more. So this ever-shifting and highly contextualized interplay of reflective openness to the new and reflective loyalty to the known points to what I think can be called cosmopolitan-mindedness, spiritedness, and heartedness. Moreover, the fusion of openness and loyalty, I think, indicates why cosmopolitanism, this term of art, does not constitute a new identity that would somehow supplant or push aside so-called local or particular identities. Rather, I think the orientation has to do with how we humans perceive, hold, and express our identities. It involves developing a charged relationship, or you might call it a living relationship, with the values that guide our lives. And in this relation, people can come to hold and express their identities and values in peaceful, communicative, and yet determined ways. They can experience why reason and why criticism are not ipso facto acidic or dissolving of custom, ceremony, tradition, but rather with the right support can enrich people's organic connections with them. People can discover, which is to say, bring into their consciousness, the primordial truth that they're not just created beings, but can also be creative persons from a cultural, moral, aesthetic, indeed many-sided point of view. So cosmopolitanism, as I've come to understand it at least, becomes something other than a theory about human life, and something other than a set of abstract principles that might inform institutional structures, valuable as such principles may be. Rather, cosmopolitanism, as I mentioned before, I think finds embodiment in lived experience, and it can constitute a substantive aspect of a philosophy of life and of education. Now this frankly normative conception of cosmopolitanism derives in part from a long-term study, as I mentioned, of what is truly an ever-mushrooming literature on this concept. I've been particularly taken by two strands of inquiry and thought on cosmopolitanism. One is traditions of philosophy as the art of living, in which theoretical questions, such as what is justice or what is knowledge, become intimately connected with profoundly practical questions, such as, am I dwelling with others justly? Are we in my community dwelling justly with other communities? What do I need to know to lead a just life? What knowledge will help us all build a more humane world? And these traditions in philosophy as the art of living reach back several millennia in both the so-called West and East. And in them, cosmopolitan motifs along the lines that I've been characterizing here seem to crop up again and again. And I'm thinking of texts as different as Confucius's Analects 2,500 years ago, the South Asian Upanishads, also written several millennia ago, Greek and Hellenistic and Roman thinkers, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, many others. It's really quite a remarkable literature that comes from different parts of the world. And I take cosmopolitanism to be closely allied with this idea of philosophy as the art of living, since, as mentioned, it highlights the lived quality of how we're dwelling in the here and now with different people, ideas, values, and practices. And finally, a second strand of work that I've been absorbed in is to me a fascinating and growing empirical and field-based literature over the past decade, in which anthropologists and sociologists and others are deploying cosmopolitanism as an interpretive framework to make sense of how people in our globalizing conditions today are finding ways to respond rather than merely to react to change, to recall that distinction I mentioned a few minutes ago. So I'll close with a few questions that are as much on my mind and that might have something to do, it seems to me, with global community. One is, does this idea of cosmopolitanism, as I sketched it all too briefly here, does it paint merely a city in words, or can it actually come to life in a city of people? I think it is alive in our cities and rural communities, but one question is, what does it actually look like? What does this orientation look like in lived practice? A second question would be, we think of cosmopolitanism as denoting citizens of the world, but why might it be equally important to think of cosmopolitanism as describing becoming inhabitants of the world, which is to say deeply rooted in the life of the world as a basis for what we think of as citizenship? Thinking especially again of Josh's notions of caring for the world in some way. And then finally, assuming a cosmopolitan orientation makes sense, as I framed it here, how might we cultivate something like this in our schools, in our universities, in our informal educational spaces, perhaps indeed at TC as a global college? So I'll stop there, and thanks very much.
Thank you. So we have the pleasure, myself and Connie, of talking a little bit about what does this look like in practice when we try to put global education into practice in higher education settings. And as we thought about this, we thought about the notion of, well, global education in part is trying to get to know what other people are like. And so it's like flags, food, and festivals. We all get to that point where in order to understand something about another culture, we need to know something about it. So we indulge and engage in it. But we felt that in some ways, I might stand over here if you don't mind. Sorry. I think I can use my teacher voice here, so I don't need to be right in front of you here. So I think as we thought about it, we thought about this in several different ways, and we thought there's something beyond flag, food, and festivals. And one of the things that brought this to mind a lot, and some of you may have seen it this past week in the New York Times, there was a very interesting article about, in the Netherlands, the coming of St. Nicholas, and his arrival, to signify his arrival when he came to the Netherlands by ship from Spain. And in that process, he came in with his faithful servants, who was a Moor by the name of Black Peter. So the article is about how challenging this notion of these festivals and cultural traditions are, because there's a lot of tensions in the notion of what this must represent to people. Those tensions exist in the Netherlands itself. One of the people said, well, we in the Netherlands kind of had the values, deep values of gradualism. So even though the notion of Black Peter with touch people putting on blackface and becoming Black Peter is offensive to some people, and people in the Netherlands are protesting about that. Nonetheless, should we give this tradition up? Because it's something that we love in other ways. So what this represented to us was that in global education, we have a number of what we were calling elephants in the room. That once you begin to start delving into this, you come up against sensitive feelings, both within yourself as well as within other people. So sometimes these undiscussables are difficult to put it on the table. We know this is true in racial issues, you know, when we try to bring them into our classrooms. And it's also true, it can also be true in global education. So these become the elephants in the room. And one of the questions that we had was, if we're bringing this to higher education, how do global educators in higher education prepare themselves and engage in this kind of an activity? And what is it that they need to know and do in order to be able to do this? Because these kinds of discussions, as we know from Mort's work and people in the conflict and collaboration world, bring up a lot of deep feelings, and that often brings emotions, and it can bring conflict, and that needs to be resolved in that classroom. So educators who may feel confused, frustrated, or unsure about their own capabilities in managing those conversations. So we're bringing to this a lens in the adult learning world of transformative learning, which is not unlike some of the work that is done in conflict and collaboration work, which kind of focuses on this notion of how do you help people to really go below the surface and look at some of these tacit things that we take for granted and put those on the table and really work with them. And in doing that, we think it has potential, and we see it not only for the learners themselves, but that you can't have transformed learners if you don't have transformed teachers. So the educators themselves have to do this deep work, and that in turn is nested in a system which itself needs to look at itself in order for it to work in any given way. This is what we want to talk to you a little bit about. Connie is doing some work in research on higher educators who are engaged in this work, and she's going to share a little bit about what it looks like and what some people are doing to kind of foster this kind of thing. Because we need to become more comfortable with being uncomfortable in order to grow in this way. And so there is a body of work that kind of supports some of the thinking that we're doing in this area that comes from the notion of transformative learning. And it does, it definitely can involve cognitive kinds of things, but it also involves deeply emotional and holistic kinds of things. It involves relationships with other people. And we can't engage in that work without looking at our own life experience and sharing the life experience of other people, and then also getting engaged in dialogue, internally with ourselves and externally with other people. And so Connie is going to share some of what that begins to look like in actual practice.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Mort. I appreciate being able to be on this panel today. This is exciting work. I work at a community college, and I'm deep into working with intercultural, international, and global types of things. My students are from all over the world with all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of ages. And so it makes this very interesting. One of the places I started for my research, some of you might be aware of the Association for International Educators. They give actually awards out to colleges and higher ed, from research intensive Ivy League schools to community colleges and everywhere in between. This year there was a number of award winners. They get about 5 or 6 award winners a year. One of them happens to be MIT, where Victoria and I have a colleague. And so we were able to do a little talking with her about what she's doing with the Global Lab. So here's an example. I have so many examples I wish I could share with you. So many quotes from educators already just in the beginning of my research. But what Michelina Jaster was able to say is, what is the real impact and time horizon? It may be much deeper impact that doesn't show up until much later. She's talking about second-year MBA students who are working what they call these global labs. And it's an action learning type of program which really gets into problem-based learning and on a real project in real time. And faculty work with teams of students all over the world. They have G-Labs in China and in India. They have a global health program. And what they're doing is think, act, reflect. So that's the pedagogy. And so I was just humbled and honored to be here at this table listening and frantically taking notes from all the professors here. And there's such interconnection between the work that's being done cross-disciplinary. And so that's what's amazing with the work they're doing here and what I'm finding from the other faculty I'm talking to. And of course, we'd be happy to talk to you more about that. When I looked at the criteria for the NASA award winners, and that's how I picked my college sites, so I'm specifically working with community college students, but I picked the sites from here. There's a lot on the applications that are flag foods and festivals based, that you're filling out, these are the kinds of things we do, and yes, we have a study abroad program and that kind of thing. But when I start to talk to the faculty, they start to have stories about what is happening in their classroom, the amazing conversations they're having, and the different types of inquiry-based learning and action learning, and how they're bridging the gaps between people sitting at a table from completely different cultures. So I think it's really exciting that what we can learn about each other. So here's a quote that I pulled. How do we create a curricular design that recognizes the rapidly increasing globalized nature of our society and economy and gives our graduates a sense of awareness and ability to operate in such a world? So this again correlates with a lot of what we were saying today here as a panel. What really strikes me is that this is, as was already said, this type of global education and these discussions are happening all over America and internationally, kindergarten, right, through to Columbia. And with my associate's degree students, being able to work and live and understand the global world is really important. It's going to help them be on the same playing field, right, as people who are graduating from Ivy Leagues. Your associate degree students are oftentimes at-risk students who haven't had access to this kind of education. So it's exciting to see that that's just as important whatever education facility you're in. So one of the ways in the context that I've been involved with global learning has been in a cohort type of program that has its pitfalls and that has its promise. I think, again, it depends on the context and what students you're working with and what the system and the structure of the school will allow, and really thinking through how you want to focus on global education. And pedagogy, of course, and curriculum are very important. And again, I don't need to go back over this again. I think many of this is already talked about. My favorite quote came from one of my interviewees talking about a window and a mirror, providing in the classroom a window where you can see yourself in the theories we discuss, in the issues around the world, and then also being able to be a mirror into how other people live and think and believe and what they hold dear, and you can do some deep thinking and understanding with that. So really we leave it with Victoria and I talking about, here's a big challenge. How do we prepare faculty to do this deep, important work? And flags, foods, and festivals are great. I love them. I mean, sitting around the table, having sharing a meal together can bring so much. But do we want to move beyond that? And are we ready to move beyond that? And are we willing to talk about the elephants in the room, in our classrooms and elsewhere?
We've had some very rich, stimulating presentations. Fortunately, they've been captured on audio-visual. So I'm not going to attempt to summarize and integrate these important and valuable presentations. But we will make these audio-visual tapes available on the internet. Let me just say that we're going to move into problem-solving groups. Each of the presenters will meet with whoever wants to meet with them in different sections of this room. You can meet with Victoria and Connie right there. You can meet with David in that corner. You can meet with Josh right here. You can meet with Bill Gaudelli in that corner and with Warner Burke in this corner. But let me say that as a psychologist, I think one can operate at two levels. One at the very large level, or one at a very, almost a small level, like I made the suggestion that one could get, if one could develop a pledge for nonviolence, that one could communicate and have adopted by students and faculty in schools throughout the United States, throughout the world. That would be a major improvement. It doesn't by itself change the nature of education. And there are other things. And I shan't address them here, but if you take any given discipline, you take the discipline of psychology, how do you get people to really experience the sense of interdependence so that it's no longer an isolated self, it's a self with other selves that they realize are integrated. And that's the only way you can avoid the dilemma of the commons. And we haven't heard much today about future generations. But if we talk about the planet Earth, we have to be concerned about the planet Earth not only for our generation and the next generation, but my great-grandchild and her great-grandchild. So how do you get people to have a future perspective that embraces much more than a limited time perspective? These are particular problems, and if you were an economist, you could name other particular problems. So go to each of your groups. Connie and Victoria there, David there, Josh there, Bill, and Morton. And if anybody wants to chat with me, I'll be happy to chat. Thank you. Let's have a report. Eric, you're reporting for
Am I reporting? Apparently I was drafted.
Okay, this is the report of Warner's group.
Well, we started our discussion talking about how do you understand how another, how do you understand how another culture understands change? Because that captures it. And then we sort of went from there. I don't know what other, that captures it, yeah. I don't want to stand between, take too much time to stand between the wine and cheese.
Well, also what was said was, it may very well be that there's a number of other countries in our world that have no need whatsoever, no desire to think globally and to be global. So how do you deal with that is one of the things that we had a pretty long discussion about.
Yeah, so our group started with the question, how do we actually make steps on implementing something like this? You know, what does actual action look like? And then we turned to, you know, what are some of the educational tools that we can implement? And we talked about our games an effective way of teaching the interconnectedness of human and physical systems. And then we talked a little bit about environmental education. So are environmental education methodologies and pedagogies capable of actually tackling this systemic view, these systemic interconnections? And unfortunately, we're a bit pessimistic that they currently aren't. And so that's a gap that needs to be filled. And so one potential action item is designing a new environmental education strategy or pedagogy. Another might be developing a game that actually teaches children to think through the implications, the environmental implications of various actions. And still we return to the question of, in a world of finite resources where people compete for those resources, is a global community possible? And it was a little heavy, but I personally am optimistic.
That's what we were doing, heavy.
Ours was heavy too, so maybe we should get right to the wine. But we talked, I went around and just asked everyone to share something about their own lives and work, and people talked about their development of mindfulness through their practices, their sort of struggle with educational policy and how educational policy, particularly in this country, does not resonate largely with global values that have been articulated here tonight, and that's a real pressing concern. We also spoke about what it means to live planetarily in a quite a literal sense, so we had some representation about what it would mean to, or what it does mean to literally move about the planet and live without a permanent residence, as someone in the group does, and it was really very fascinating. And then we also talked briefly about what it means to be global in the sense that we learn across the stratified society that we live in. And people talked about, you know, being a teacher in this city, learning from taxi drivers to presidents of university and all matter and in between, really living, I guess I would invoke Dewey again, apologies, but conjointly and communicatively in our lives. So that type of discussion is what we had, and it was quite lovely, and wish we had more time, but that's where we are.
So our group, David, Victoria, and Connie, and others, yeah, we talked about speed and reproduction, producing and consuming, and this the speed of getting caught up in those things, and how might we reflect, and the point that reflection is a kind of action, and that we might think how to slow down and include and open, that the transformations that we're seeking and the sense of community would come from being open to the many worldviews that are among us here, the kind of, I think, really rich resources that are already in the room. And that this kind of slowing down would be really necessary to develop the kind of sense of community where we're not all community based on we are in this school or in this form of education or pass these tests, but really perhaps really exchanging worldviews would be a kind of curriculum that was long, serious learning engagement over years. And that if we think about that, that really helps us to problematize what global education might be and to think about it in fresh ways.
Can I just add too, because I thought the conversation we were sort of getting to at the end was also really a build on that. And the question was raised is, you know, what's the definition of global education? Is this a Western view about what other people should be thinking? And I think that that's a very, you know, very interesting and important question to be raised. You know, what do we really mean by it? Is it a homogenized kind of thing, or is it? I see that you guys were talking about the same thing. Yeah.
Quick footnote to that: the school that I mentioned in Thailand does not refer to themselves in those terms for that very reason.
We've had, I think, a very important discussion, a very valuable discussion. There's been some pessimism raised, so let me repeat what I said. Let us maintain hope that we can improve the world rather than embrace the cynicism that it cannot be done, and let us fulfill our hope by actions. And the actions can be relatively small. You will not solve the problems all at once. As I suggested in my opening remarks, if we could get in the paper that Susan and I wrote, I had a statement that of basic values that could be communicated to everybody in the world, because they are the values in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and FDR's Four Freedoms. And at the end of it, there was ask them to make a pledge, to commit themselves to pursue these values in their life, in their local community, and in the global community, and to help others fulfill their pledges. It's a little thing that could be done. So don't lose hope, because you only see the giant things that have to be done. The giant things will happen because you do a lot of little things.